What is the smallest machine that has ever destroyed the largest thing? On the morning of November 20th, 1980, a 14-inch drill bit attached to a drill string operated by the Wilson Brothers Corporation under contract to Texaco Oil was probing the bed of Lake Peigneur in Iberia Parish, Louisiana, searching for petroleum deposits in the geological formations beneath the lake floor. The bit was 14 inches in diameter, roughly the width of a large dinner plate. The lake above it covered 1,300 acres of south-central coastal Louisiana. The lake was 11 feet deep. It was freshwater. It was unremarkable. Fishermen used it. A botanical garden called Live Oak Gardens sat on Jefferson Island at its southeastern edge, with specimen trees and formal plantings that had been maintained since the 1870s, when the actor Joseph Jefferson had built a mansion there and named it Rip Van Winkle Gardens, after his most famous theatrical role. Beneath the lake and beneath Jefferson Island, extending to depths of 1,500 feet, was a salt mine. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company had been mining salt from the Jefferson Island Salt Dome since 1919, excavating tunnels 100 feet wide and 80 feet high through solid rock salt, leaving pillars of salt in place to support the ceilings, creating an underground labyrinth of cathedral-sized chambers at multiple levels, the deepest reaching more than a quarter of a mile beneath the surface. The mine produced table salt, road de-icing salt, and industrial salt, and it had been operating for 61 years without incident. At approximately 7 a.m. on November 20th, the drill crew reported that the 14-inch bit had become stuck at a depth of 1,228 feet. The crew attempted to free the bit using standard procedures. They applied torque. They worked the drill string up and down. They could not free it. Then the men on the platform heard a series of loud popping sounds from beneath the rig. The platform began to tilt, 2 to 3 feet at first, then more. The crew recognized that something was seriously and fundamentally wrong. They cut the barges loose from the rig, scrambled off the platform, and moved to the shore roughly 300 yards away. They had time. Barely. Shortly after the crew abandoned the platform, they watched the $5 million Texaco drilling rig overturn and disappear into the lake. A lake that was 11 feet deep swallowed a drilling rig that was several stories tall. The rig went under and did not come back up. In its place, the water began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster. A whirlpool formed, centered directly over the drill site, expanding to a quarter of a mile in diameter, rotating with increasing speed and force, pulling everything on the surface of the lake toward its center. The 14-inch drill bit had punctured the ceiling of the Diamond Crystal Salt Company's mine. I went looking for the records of what happened next. What I found was the most complete and most rapid industrial catastrophe in American history, measured not in years or decades or generations like the other stories on this channel, but in hours. 3 hours. In 3 hours, a 14-inch hole in the ceiling of a salt mine drained 3.5 billion gallons of fresh water from a 1,300-acre lake, swallowed a drilling rig, a second drilling platform, 11 barges, a tugboat, a barge loading dock, 65 acres of Jefferson Island, including 150-foot pecan trees and a parking lot and a house trailer, reversed the flow of a 12-mile canal connecting the lake to the Gulf of Mexico, and created a 150-foot waterfall where the Gulf of Mexico poured backward into the hole that had been a lake. The entire sequence, from the moment the drill bit stuck to the moment the lake was drained, took approximately 3 hours. The physics of the disaster are simple and devastating. The 14-inch hole that the drill bit opened in the mine ceiling allowed lake water to enter the mine. The water that entered the mine came into contact with the salt walls and salt pillars of the mine tunnels. Salt dissolves in water. The water dissolved the edges of the hole, making it larger. The larger hole admitted more water. The more water dissolved, more salt. The cycle accelerated. The initial 14-inch opening, roughly the diameter of a dinner plate, expanded minute by minute as the fresh water ate the salt around it. Within a short time, the opening was no longer 14 inches. It was feet wide, then yards. Then the ceiling of the mine tunnel collapsed entirely, and the hole became a shaft, and the lake poured into the mine through a widening chasm in the earth beneath the lake floor. The mine's tunnels were enormous. They had been excavated over 61 years by generations of salt miners who had carved rooms 100 feet wide and 80 feet high through solid rock salt, leaving pillars at regular intervals to support the ceiling. The tunnels extended across multiple levels, the deepest at 1,500 feet, connected by shafts and ramps. The combined volume of the mined-out chambers was vast, enough to hold the entire lake. When the water entered the tunnels, it dissolved the salt pillars that were supporting the ceilings. The pillars had been left in place specifically to prevent collapse. The water removed them. The ceilings collapsed. The collapses cascaded from chamber to chamber, level to level, as each failure exposed new surfaces of salt to the dissolving force of the incoming water. The mine was not just flooding, it was disintegrating. On the surface, the whirlpool intensified as the mine beneath it continued to collapse, and the hole in the lake floor continued to widen. The rotation pulled everything within its reach toward the center with a force that increased as the drainage accelerated. 11 barges that had been anchored in the Delcambre Canal on the south side of the lake, loaded with drilling supplies and equipment for the Texaco operation, were dragged one by one into the vortex. The barges were not small vessels. They were industrial supply barges, flat-bottomed steel hulls loaded with pipe, mud, chemicals, and equipment. The current that the draining lake created in the canal was strong enough to pull them from their moorings, drag them across the surface of the rotating water, draw them into the center of the quarter-mile-wide whirlpool, upend them, and suck them beneath the surface into the collapsing mine below. 11 times, a steel barge loaded with industrial equipment was pulled into a hole in the bottom of a lake that had been 11 feet deep that morning and was now a funnel into the earth. Each barge disappeared the same way, pulled sideways by the current, drawn toward the center, tilted by the rotation, and then swallowed vertically into the vortex, the hull vanishing beneath the surface in a churning mass of brown water and debris. A tugboat on the canal, whose crew had been servicing the barges, was caught in the same current. The tug's engines were running. The captain fought the current, driving the engines at full throttle against the flow of water that was now rushing northward from the canal into the draining lake. The tug lost. The current overpowered the engines. The crew, realizing that the boat was being pulled backward toward the whirlpool and that the engines could not hold against the force of 3.5 billion gallons of water draining into a hole in the earth, made the decision that saved their lives. They leaped from the tug onto the canal bank and stood on solid ground and watched as the tugboat was pulled stern first into the whirlpool and disappeared. A second drilling platform, located near the original Texaco rig, was swallowed whole. The entire platform and its derrick and its equipment pulled beneath the surface and into the mine, a barge loading dock on the shore of the lake, a permanent concrete and steel structure built to handle the transfer of materials between barges and shore vehicles, was undermined by the expanding sinkhole and collapsed into the water and was consumed by the vortex. The destruction was not limited to the water. As the mine tunnels collapsed beneath Jefferson Island, the ground above them subsided. The southern portion of the island began to sink. 65 acres of Jefferson Island, including the southern grounds of the Live Oak Gardens Botanical Garden, collapsed into the expanding sinkhole. The Live Oak Gardens had been one of the most significant botanical collections in Louisiana, maintained continuously since the 1870s, when the actor Joseph Jefferson had purchased the property and begun planting ornamental trees and specimen plants on the grounds of his winter home. The gardens contained live oaks that were centuries old, pecan trees that stood 150 feet tall, formal plantings of azaleas and camellias, brick walkways, garden structures, and the infrastructure of a commercial plant nursery that supplied ornamental plants to customers across the Gulf Coast. 65 acres of this, the trees, the plantings, the walkways, the nursery greenhouses, the soil they were rooted in, the ground they stood on, dropped into the earth as the salt mine beneath them dissolved and collapsed. The 150-foot pecan trees toppled into the water and were drawn into the vortex and disappeared. Trucks that had been parked on the island's service road slid into the expanding crater. A house trailer was swallowed. A parking lot with vehicles on it cracked apart and dropped into the sinkhole section by section, the asphalt breaking into slabs that tilted and slid into the brown, churning water like cards from a collapsing house. The air that was trapped inside the mine tunnels as the water flooded them was compressed by the incoming water and forced upward through cracks and fissures in the collapsing earth. The compressed air erupted from the surface of the lake as a geyser, a jet of water and debris that eyewitnesses described as shooting 400 feet into the air. The geyser was the mine breathing its last breath. The air came up, the water went down. If this story interests you, the Mine Safety and Health Administration released a report in August 1981 documenting the event in detail. The geology is in the report. The timeline is in the report. The evidence that could have confirmed the exact cause of the drilling miscalculation, whether it was a coordinate error or incorrect mine maps, was washed away in the whirlpool. Don't take my word for it. Look at what the report shows. And subscribe if you want to see where the next thread leads. The Delcambre Canal, a man-made waterway that connected the southern end of Lake Peigneur to Vermilion Bay in the Gulf of Mexico, 12 miles to the south, normally drained water from the lake toward the Gulf. It was a slow, tidal canal used for fishing boat access and minor commercial traffic. As the lake drained into the mine, the water level in the lake dropped below the level of the canal. The canal, which had been flowing south toward the Gulf, reversed direction. The water in the canal began flowing north, backward, from the Gulf of Mexico into the empty basin that had been Lake Peigneur. The reversed flow accelerated as the lake emptied further. Where the canal met the edge of the collapsing lake bed, the water dropped over a ledge. The drop formed a waterfall. The waterfall was 150 feet high. 150 feet of Gulf of Mexico water pouring backward into a hole in the earth that had been a freshwater lake 3 hours earlier. A fisherman who had been on the lake that morning, Leonce Viator Jr., was caught in the initial stages of the drainage. His small fishing boat was pulled toward the whirlpool. He and his fishing partner struggled to reach the shore and barely made it, abandoning the boat. Viator later described the scene. That water was roaring, I'm not kidding you a bit. The wind was blowing and everything seemed to go dry on the earth and we were sitting on the mud. Beneath the surface, 55 salt miners were working in the diamond crystal mine when the water arrived. The miners worked in shifts, descending through the main shaft to whatever level they were assigned, walking through tunnels carved from solid white and gray rock salt that glistened in the electric lighting, operating drilling equipment and loading machines that cut the salt from the walls and floor and loaded it into mine cars for transport to the shaft and hoisting to the surface. The work was physically demanding, but not inherently dangerous in the way that coal mining or hard rock metal mining was dangerous. Salt mines do not produce methane. Salt mines do not have coal dust explosions. The ceilings, when properly supported by the pillars, are stable. The air is clean and dry. A salt mine is, under normal conditions, one of the safer underground mining environments. The one thing a salt mine cannot tolerate is water. Water is the enemy of a salt mine the way fire is the enemy of a coal mine. Water dissolves the walls. Water dissolves the pillars. Water dissolves the ceiling. Water turns a structurally sound underground chamber into a collapsing void. The chief electrician on the third level was the first to notice. He heard a strange sound, a rushing noise that did not belong in a dry salt mine, a sound he had never heard in the tunnels before. He looked down at the mine floor and saw murky water spreading across the white salt surface. Water does not appear in a dry salt mine. The water was brown, stained with the sediment from the lake bed, and it was coming from somewhere it should not have been coming from, and it was rising visibly, inch by inch, across the floor of the tunnel. The chief electrician understood immediately what the water meant. He sounded the alarm. The mine had an evacuation plan. The plan had been developed because the mining engineers who had designed the mine understood that water intrusion, however unlikely, was the one catastrophe that could not be managed underground. If water entered a salt mine, the only response was to get out. There was no pumping system large enough to remove the volume of water that a serious breach could admit. There was no way to seal a hole in the mine ceiling while the lake was pouring through it. The only option was evacuation. The miners did not debate whether to follow the plan. They did not wait to see how fast the water was rising. They did not attempt to locate the source of the flooding. They did not go back for their equipment or their personal belongings. They ran. 55 miners on multiple levels of the mine dropped their tools where they stood and moved toward the emergency escape shafts. Vertical shafts equipped with metal ladders bolted to the shaft walls that connected each level of the mine to the surface. The emergency shafts were separate from the main production shaft. They existed for one purpose: to get the miners out of the mine if the main shaft became unusable. The ladders were vertical. The climb was straight up through a narrow shaft, rung by rung, level by level, from the working depth to the surface. The men on the deepest levels had the farthest to climb and the least time to do it. They climbed in the dark, in a mine that was filling with water beneath them, through shafts that had been built as emergency exits decades ago and had never been used as emergency exits in the mine's 61-year history. The water was rising behind them and below them, flooding the lower levels first, climbing the shafts as the volume of incoming water from the lake above exceeded the volume of the mine's remaining airspace. Every miner made it out. 55 men climbed from the depths of the salt mine to the surface through emergency shafts, while 3.5 billion gallons of water poured into the tunnels behind them and beneath them and around them. 0 human fatalities. 0 serious injuries. The last miners to emerge from the shafts were soaked, exhausted, and shaking. The water had been closed behind them. The margin between their escape and their deaths was measured in minutes, perhaps less. 3 dogs that had been in the mine, kept as companions by the miners in the tradition of underground mining operations across the country, did not make it out. The mine did not survive. The salt pillars dissolved. The tunnels collapsed. The mine that had been operating since 1919, that had employed hundreds of workers and produced salt for tables and roads and industrial processes across the Gulf Coast for 61 years, was destroyed in 3 hours by freshwater dissolving the very material it had been built to extract. The mine was closed permanently in December 1986. It has never been reopened. The drilling rig, the second platform, the tugboat, and 2 of the 11 barges are still entombed in the flooded mine, buried beneath the collapsed tunnels and the salt and the water, in the dark, a quarter of a mile beneath the surface of a lake that no longer resembles the lake that existed on November 19, 1980. The lake refilled. Over the next 2 days, the Gulf of Mexico water that was pouring backward through the Canal and over the 150-foot waterfall filled the basin that had been Lake Peigneur. The basin was now much deeper than the original lake because the mine collapses had removed the material beneath the original lake floor, creating a void that extended to the depth of the deepest mine level. The original Lake Peigneur had been 11 feet deep at its deepest point. The new Lake Peigneur is approximately 200 feet deep at the location of the original drill site and the mine collapse. The original lake was freshwater, fed by local drainage and rainfall. The new lake is saltwater, fed by the Gulf of Mexico through the Canal, which eventually resumed its normal southward flow, but had already introduced enough seawater to permanently alter the lake's chemistry. The biology of the lake was transformed. The freshwater fish, the freshwater plants, the freshwater invertebrates that had inhabited the lake since its formation were replaced by saltwater and brackish water species that had never existed there before. The ecology of Lake Peigneur was permanently converted from a freshwater system to a saltwater system by a 14-inch drill bit that was in the wrong place by a margin that the Mine Safety and Health Administration's 1981 report was unable to precisely determine because the evidence was dissolved by the water that the mistake admitted. Days after the disaster, once the water pressure inside the flooded mine equalized with the water level in the refilled lake, 9 of the 11 sunken barges that had been swallowed by the whirlpool popped back up to the surface. The compressed air trapped beneath the barges' hulls, which had been holding the barges down as the water pressure pushed them into the mine, released as the pressure equalized, and the barges floated to the surface like corks in a bathtub. 9 barges, some of them surprisingly intact, reappeared on a lake that had swallowed them whole 3 days earlier. The drilling rig did not reappear. The tugboat did not reappear. They remain in the mine. A chimney from a house that once stood on the old lake's edge now pokes above the surface of the deeper, saltier lake. The chimney belonged to a structure that was at the shoreline when the lake was 11 feet deep. The house is submerged. The chimney, which once rose from the roof line, is now at water level. It is one of the most photographed features of the disaster's aftermath. A single brick column standing in the water, marking the elevation of the old shoreline beneath the surface of the new lake. In 1983, Texaco and the drilling contractor Wilson Brothers paid $32 million to the Diamond Crystal Salt Company to compensate for the destruction of the mine. Texaco, Wilson Brothers, and Diamond Crystal also paid a combined $12.8 million to the Live Oak Gardens Botanical Garden and Plant Nursery for the 65 acres of Jefferson Island that had been swallowed by the sinkhole, including the loss of irreplaceable specimen trees and formal plantings that had been maintained for over a century. The total settlement exceeded $45 million. The Mine Safety and Health Administration's report, released in August 1981, documented the sequence of events in 98 pages of technical analysis. The report did not assign an official cause for the drilling miscalculation. 2 explanations were disputed: a coordinate error in the drilling company's survey calculations, or errors in the mine maps that had been provided to the drilling contractor showing the locations of the mined-out chambers. The evidence that could have resolved the dispute was at the bottom of a flooded salt mine beneath a lake that was now 200 feet deep in salt water. Since 1994, AGL Resources has used the salt dome beneath Lake Peigneur as a storage and hub facility for pressurized natural gas, injecting gas into the remaining salt cavities for storage and distribution. The decision to store pressurized natural gas in the geological formation that had catastrophically failed in 1980 has generated concern among local residents who remember what happened the last time 2 extraction industries shared the same underground space. I started with a question about the smallest machine that has ever destroyed the largest thing. The answer is a 14-inch drill bit, 14 inches in diameter, the width of a dinner plate. The bit punctured the ceiling of a salt mine that had been operating for 61 years in a lake that covered 1,300 acres. And in 3 hours, the lake was gone, replaced by a hole 200 feet deep that filled with salt water from the Gulf of Mexico. The bit drained 3.5 billion gallons of fresh water. It swallowed a $5 million drilling rig, a tugboat, 11 barges, 65 acres of an island, a botanical garden, a parking lot, and 150-foot pecan trees. It dissolved a salt mine that had employed hundreds of workers for 6 decades. It reversed a 12-mile canal and created a 150-foot waterfall flowing backward from the Gulf of Mexico into a hole in the ground. It permanently converted a freshwater lake into a saltwater abyss. It did all of this because a drill string was in the wrong position by a distance that nobody has been able to measure, because the measurement was destroyed by the catastrophe it caused. The 14-inch bit is still down there, in the mine, in the dark, under 200 feet of salt water, with the drilling rig and the tugboat and the 2 barges that never came back up. The 55 miners who were underground when the water entered the mine climbed out through emergency shafts and survived. Every one of them. The mine's evacuation plan, designed by engineers who anticipated flooding, built into the infrastructure of the mine decades before the disaster, saved 55 lives in a catastrophe that should have killed all of them. The plan worked because somebody built the shafts. The shafts worked because somebody maintained the ladders. The ladders held because somebody inspected them, and the miners survived because the machine that was designed to save them, the escape shaft, did its job on the one day it was needed. The machine that destroyed the mine was 14 inches wide. The machines that saved the miners were ladders and shafts, built by men whose names are not in the Mine Safety and Health Administration's report, but whose work is the reason 55 men walked out of a salt mine that was filling with 3.5 billion gallons of water. There are more of these stories, more machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how the copper stamp mills of the Keweenaw Peninsula crushed the ore that wired America and dumped 64 million tons of waste into Lake Superior, that video is on screen now.